All right. Good evening, everybody. This is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. It's currently 1 o'clock in the morning here, but unfortunately, this was the only time I really had to make a video. It's been a long, busy day, and the last 2 weeks have been pretty long and busy, but that's no excuse not to have a nice conversation about the recently released roadmap. And there's lots of questions floating about, comments and other such things, and it's morning and afternoon in Asia, so I figured why not forego a little bit more sleep and let you guys know a few things. Okay, so we spent about a month and a half in deep and detailed discussions about what would be the best scaffolding and skeleton for the roadmap. And we came to the decision to release what we just recently released. And as you can see, it's broken down into different sections: the Byron section, the Shelley section, the Basho section, the Gauguin section, the Basho section, and the Voltaire section. And each of them covers a different scoping of the project. Briefly, the purpose of Byron was basically to release something, to build a community around it, to learn how to be on exchanges, to learn how to write APIs that the cryptocurrency space would like to use, to work with third-party integrators, to build all the development life cycles, and also to write a source base that we would then be able to at some point come back to and say, okay, well, what didn't we do so optimally? And for the most part, Byron is a success in that respect, an overwhelming success when you compare it to a normal cryptocurrency. It didn't live up to my expectations in terms of how quickly we were able to get software out, or how quickly we were able to move through the Byron era. But of all the eras, that's by definition going to be the slowest, because that's the one where you know the least, and that's the one where everybody is doing something for the first time. So we've exited the Byron era, and we're now in the Shelley era, and things are moving pretty quickly now. The self-node testnet is being prepped, and some people have started already independently vetting it and playing around with it, because we did a release on the GitHub repo just a few days ago. And now we're prepping some documentation, some of the website, and a lot of other things to get people along. In addition to that, about 150 people have filled out the form that we sent out and given us an ample amount of information about what they intend on doing, their technical background, their geographic location, and also the relationship to the ADA ecosystem, as well as the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem. The Stake Pool Task Force channel has well more than 1,500 people in it, and our hope is that that will continue to grow. So the opening up of the Shelley world to the general public is well underway, and we're very happy about that. Moving beyond that, hackathons are underway, and we're just about to hold one in Israel. I'll be traveling to Israel in the next few weeks, and we're going to be holding another hackathon in Argentina. We're planning probably towards the end of July, and then we'll be holding a fairly large hackathon, hopefully up in Wyoming in September. Every time we do this exposes both Plutus and Marlowe to the general public. We've already gotten an enormous amount of feedback, a lot of advice about the types of things we need to do to make what we've written a bit more developer friendly. So Gauguin progress is looking quite great, and we're going from an R&D product management cycle to now more of a actual consumer product, an actual product useful for developers. So that's nice to see. So anyway, the roadmap that we released, it's written in a way that allows us to add a lot more detail, or links to a lot more detail, in a very systematic manner. So over time, all of those little parts you see about features and narratives and other things will eventually link to videos. It'll link to blog posts. It'll link to specialized content. So our content teams, our comms teams, our marketing teams can continuously go back to that same very simple interface and just keep adding and adding and adding and adding. In addition to that, it amends very well to continuous updates. So I'm going on the Cardano effect with David tomorrow, but the recording probably won't be uploaded to the general public until Monday or Tuesday. But on that show, we're going to cover some of the plans that we've come up with about how we're going to be a bit more proactive in giving weekly and monthly updates to the general community, and also doing more interactive updates. So for example, I do AMAs, but it's very important that people involved in product management also do AMAs, and hopefully developers start participating in AMAs as well. So as a consequence, I'd like for David on a monthly basis, hopefully monthly, maybe every 6 weeks, to do an AMA with you guys and give you some ample timing on the schedule so you can ask questions in advance. I tend to do surprise AMAs because they're a bit more fun for me. Anyway, so the roadmap will become kind of an archive of these events, and it's just a good place to keep going to time and again, and I'd highly encourage people to keep going there. And we'll be adding more content on a pretty regular basis. We put a lot of Goguen related information, and that will be filled out in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And then we're going to move on to Basho and Voltaire and continue to fill out information there. So I'm pretty happy with the redesign. I think it's a really good big first step in the right direction, and it's a much more mature step and a realistic step given the nature of the project. See, when we first came in and we looked at this, we tried to look at it from a very traditional project management viewpoint. So we had Gantt charts and all these percentages and all these things that you normally do if you're writing a well-defined, well-scoped, well-understood piece of software. But that's not really where we ever went. We were building cryptocurrencies based on research and all these protocols that never seen the light of day. So we really needed a more agile approach. And it took quite a bit of time for the organization to kind of move in that direction. But one of the problems was that two of the development arms, one being the formal methods group and the other being research, doesn't amend so well to an agile process. It's a little bit more waterfally. So it kind of took us some time to figure out, well, how do we keep our principles but move with a degree of agility? And the old roadmap reflected the old way of thinking. The new roadmap kind of reflects the new way of thinking. And what's really nice is we're starting to get down to what Cardano was talking about back in 2017, where we'd like to have these small competing agile teams of 3 to 7 people doing a very focused thing. And that team by aggregate will kind of build up to emergently a whole ecosystem. So the biggest epitome of this is the Haskell Wallet backend repo that we did. We started a complete redesign of that team last year in November, December timeframe. And now, literally every single week, we get a wonderful release of something, and they've just been moving at blinding speeds. Not only that, they've been moving at blinding speeds with great processes and also great testing. In fact, Cardano is adopting Bech32 as an address structure for Shelley. And while we were integrating the Haskell Bech32 library, we found not only bugs, but we also found some design defects in the specification itself for Bech32. And this is a consequence of our property-based testing that we were doing. So the fact that we're able to follow an extreme programming model in that team, it's modular software, so it can be plugged into both the Rust and the Haskell client, or even other software stacks potentially. And week by week, we're able to move very quickly, but yet we're still using formal methods is actually a really remarkable achievement. And I'm super proud of that. And not to be outdone, the other teams are starting to now converge to that. We're starting to get a lot more demos, and it's nice to see this. So the roadmap is kind of a reflection of this new process, this new organizational way of doing things, and we're quite a bit more agile. What it means is you're going to see less of these big dumps where massive things get released, and then it takes a long time for people to parse it, and you're going to see a lot more iterative stuff. So every day, every week, every month, things are just going to start organically coming out. Now, there have been some questions about prioritizations or deprioritizations and also kind of the architectural direction of Cardano. So one of the things that's come up is a discussion of, well, what are we going to do with KVM, Yella, and the K framework in general? And so this was one of those high-risk, high-return pieces of research. We had several high-risk, high-return pieces of research in the Cardano agenda. So one was Ouroboros. So the whole concept of, can you do proof of stake? That was very high risk. It wasn't completely decided in the ecosystem whether it was even theoretically possible. And if you ask the proof of work people on the Bitcoin side, they actually say even today it's still not. So back in 2015, this was a big open question, and there had been some projects that had done things, but no one had really done things with rigor or to a massive scale. Now, obviously, certain communities will disagree, but the fact that none of the top 15, top 20 cryptocurrencies in 2015 were reliably running with a proof of stake system, outside of a few aberrant examples, that would come in and come out. It really told you the state of things. So we decided to invest an enormous amount of money, time, and effort into trying to do that high risk, high return research. And that part of the project was overwhelmingly successful. Not only has Ouroboros borne fruit, we now are ahead of everyone in terms of a stable, beautiful design for proof of stake. And we're in the fine tuning and fine details phase, whereas a lot of people are still kind of exploring their design space and trying to figure out optimal ways of doing things. So mission accomplished, I'd say, with that research thread. And there's a degree of inevitability and determinism there, where the things we want to do will get done. So great there. The second piece of high risk, high return research was this concept of sidechains and interoperability through structures like NIPA-POWs and proof of stake sidechains. And this was another one of those high risk, high return ideas, because you could end up spending years just thinking about various ways you can do this. And it does take a lot of deep thought. And it's a very broad moving target, because basically what you wish to accomplish with this is this concept of, you've sent me a transaction from either a local or foreign chain, so either the cryptocurrency itself or from another cryptocurrency. I don't have the blockchain. I just have some small amount of information. And yet somehow I'd still like to have the same security as a person who possesses the whole blockchain of that asset. And I can verify that the asset has not been double spent and that the asset exists. Now, if you can solve this problem, you get awesome like clients, you really help the scalability side of things. And furthermore, you allow systems to talk and work with each other in a much more natural way. So this has been one of the major pillars of the project, and something we've explored a lot. And it's, again, high risk, high return research. And thanks to Dionysis Zindros's hard work and Agalos's hard work, and a lot of our partners who we've done research with and had deep and detailed discussions with, we also feel that that direction has a degree of inevitability to it, just like the proof of stake research has a degree of inevitability. So I'm quite happy with that. The third high risk, high return pillar was this whole concept of, can we build an ideal programming model for cryptocurrencies? It's something that makes a lot of sense, not just for smart contracts, but also for how smart contracts would interact with the broader world. You see, it's not just about, can I write some Solidity code and get it to work on Ethereum? That is the heart of a dApp. It's also the fact that that application is going to be talking to things that live outside of a blockchain. It's something that lives on your computer, on a trusted server, on a federation of servers, or perhaps a confederation of blockchains all talking to each other. So there's this concept of on-chain and off-chain code that you somehow have to reconcile. And you have to figure out, how do I build applications where I have determinism and predictability where I need it, and that I also actually wrote is not significant. It's fairly small. And this is a huge problem. And when you don't get it right, you have things like the DAO hack. And when you don't get it right, you have things like the parity hack. Furthermore, it also yields issues of performance and scalability and these types of things. So, okay, how are you actually going to build a system where not only can you sort all these things out and you can get semantical correctness, but also the system is reasonably performant for all users, not just a particular group or for a particular window of time, but when you go from 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 to 1,000,000 and so forth, that things are, things are actually moving in the right direction. Everybody's basically getting reasonable performance. Now, we implicitly know this. For example, we have Netflix and we have Google and Amazon and Facebook and these giant services that, despite the fact that they have millions to billions of users, and despite the fact that these users are really pushing these systems to their limits, they're being very intensive. They're uploading videos, they're streaming content, they're doing tens of thousands of searches all the time. Yet somehow you get a fairly good experience. So the key is, can we take those ideas and those lessons and put them into a model that somehow is still decentralized and preserves your trust and your privacy and these types of things? So it's a huge challenge. So the bedrock of all of this, though, is your computational model and in your programming languages that you write your smart contracts in. So we took a very pragmatic approach. You can either be on the functional side of the world, or you can be on the imperative side of the world. Okay, so you can look at languages like Java and C++ and JavaScript, or Python, or you can look at languages like Lisp and Haskell and OCaml and Clojure and so forth. Okay, so what we said is, look, we have enough money. Let's explore both of these paths, and let's try to innovate within those spaces with an eye on, first, formal correctness, and second, having a nice path to broad-scale interoperability. Okay, because at the end of the day, developers are going to want to write in the languages that they're comfortable and familiar with within their domain. So, we'd like them to be able to reuse tooling. We'd like them to be able to reuse the things they care about. So one team led by Phil Wadler and later Manuel Chakravarty, alongside Phil Wadler and many others, explored the functional side of the world. And they're among the most qualified people in the world to explore that, because they created functional programming languages like Haskell. And they've been in this space for well more than 30 years. And collectively, the team has more than 100 years of experience. So that team went off and said, let's use ideas like template Haskell, and let's implement DSLs to do the on-chain thing. So in case of Marlowe, it's a Turing incomplete DSL for modeling financial contracts. And in the case of Plutus, it's a Turing complete, fully powerful programming language, but a lot lighter than Haskell. And then let's allow your off-chain code to be a full, older programming language with lots of history and legacy and good tools around it. And then the idea is that this two-layer model, something that runs on-chain, something that runs off-chain, the on-chain being a DSL, the off-chain being a general-purpose programming language, would be a nice template that we could then play around with within that domain. And we get a lot of power. We'd be able to write formal specifications for contracts. Design by contract would be somewhat easy to approach. And we'd be able to use property-based testing and model checking and all these other tools that you really need to use or should be using when you're writing high-assurance code. And smart contracts are probably the definition of code that ought to be high assurance. Because you're talking about code that you're going to run a lot in a very hostile setting that's concise with a well-defined business logic behind it. That's code you should verify. So that side of the project was overwhelmingly successful. It took about 2 years for us to really get to a point where we knew the exact thread and path of how we wanted to go through it. But now we see consistent progress week by week, month by month. And not only are we innovating there, we're actually now improving the state of affairs in the functional programming world, not just for cryptocurrencies, but in general. For example, IOHK is actively contributing developers to the Haskell to WebAssembly effort. So you can take Haskell code and Plutus code and you can compile that to run in WebAssembly. We're also actively contributing to the GHC.js program, which means you can take Haskell code and convert it to JavaScript. So we view that these are vital efforts so that you can deploy your off-chain code in Node and in the browser and other places, and that infrastructure we're building can work in web applications and browser-based applications without having to be translated or ported. It just works through a compilation chain, like you can experience with Rust and other languages like that. So that work is coming along quite well, and we're validating that model works through hackathons. So we're taking what we have and we're giving it to developers and getting feedback from developers about where we go next. And we're seeing great acceleration there. Okay, second, the other side, the imperative side, it's not too hard to innovate there because it's a very broad space and there's a lot to do. But we didn't want to do something just like, for example, come up with a new virtual machine and say, okay, look, we have a new virtual machine, or take a subset of an existing virtual machine, like the Java virtual machine, as Aeon has done, or look at WebAssembly and just somehow translate it with a gas model and say, okay, well, now we have something like what Ethereum's trying to do with EWASM. Okay. So in that particular case, we wanted to explore something a bit more general and broader. And this is why we were really in love with the K framework and ideas that Grigori Roshu's team had come up with at runtime verification. So again, being high risk, high return research, we took a step back and we said, let's go roll the dice and see how far along we could take this research. So we put a few $1 million of capital down to enhancing K, so rewriting K in Haskell, exploring techniques and concepts like semantics-based compilation, as well as trying to improve the performance of the machine-generated code. And there was some great success there, but it wasn't far enough along for us as a project to really feel comfortable saying within the 2020 timeframe that this collection of technology would be viable for consumerization and would definitely deliver to market a great experience for developers. So we had to take a step back and say that the strategy has to be changed a bit. So the concepts were great. So this concept of saying you can take any programming language, you can write the case semantics of that programming language, and then suddenly, through the magic of semantics-based compilation, all programs written in that language could just somehow be compiled to run on the Yellow virtual machine. That would just be magical, because it means to get support for new programming language, all I'd have to do is just simply write the semantics of that language once and store them, let's say, on the blockchain, and then suddenly all those programs can work in my system. So it's a game where over time I could support hundreds and eventually thousands of programming languages. Furthermore, I never have to rewrite my compilers when I upgrade the core virtual machine. I just have to upgrade the case semantics for that virtual machine, and somehow everything just takes care of itself. So this is still ongoing and active research in academia at runtime verification, and there are other parties who have witnessed the power of K. QuantStamp, for example, is using K-defined formally specified things like the ERC20 specification, the 721 specification for auditing. And furthermore, Elrond, which is a project, I believe, based in Romania, has recently written a Go K backend so that they can explore the K virtual machine for EVM and explore ELA and so forth. So we're on good terms with these projects, and we talk to them. And while we deprioritize that stream, we're going to be following that along. But to be clear, interoperability with the KEVM, interoperability with Yella, interoperability with Solidity, WASM, this is not a hard thing to do. And we've explored it with the Cardano SL testnet that we ran last year. We've written Mantis, and we know how to build an Ethereum virtual machine from scratch. We've done it twice. It would not be difficult for us to pull that into the stack for the sake of interoperability. And if this is a desire that the community has, it's not going to really take too much effort, money, or time. So we decided to focus on where we're getting the biggest bang for our buck in terms of innovation. So currently on the functional side, and bring something new to the space and bring a whole new group of developers into the space so we can get great experiences and great applications out of that. And then the other side, the KVM and Yella side, not going away. They just basically have been deprioritized, and we're going to examine them at a later date. And the whole space is moving rather rapidly on the imperative side. There's a lot of options we have. And frankly, we don't actually have to write new code. We can simply take some best practice off the market and bring it in for the sake of interoperability if this is a high priority. So that's the nature of these projects, is that sometimes when you're doing high risk, high return research, some of the research works really well for you. For example, the case of sidechains and proof of stake. Other research, it takes 2 years plus to get to a point where you have a clear thread of where to go, which is what happened with Plutus. Then it works really well with you. And other research is just so powerful and broad that some cases you don't quite get where you want to go, and you realize that you're probably not going to hit your trajectory. So that's where we're at there. Now, in terms of Rena, that's another example of high risk, high return research that we've been doing. And what we did is we downscoped Rena to something that we felt we can implement within the 2020 timeframe. And actually, we've borne a lot of great fruit. The network team at IOHK has worked for over a year now implementing this mini protocol concept. And at some point, we'll release a nice piece of documentation explaining how this design works. But what we've done is isolated a lot of the things that we felt were real big innovations in the Rena protocol and try to apply them to the needs of the cryptocurrency space. We also very carefully examine the needs of Ouroboros and the particular things that you're going to have to do there to make that performant and work well. And we were able to extract those and put those into a bespoke network stack for Cardano. So if you're interested in that, we have a GitHub repository where that code is being written. I believe it's Ouroboros Network or Cardano Network. I can't recall the exact repo, but if you look through our repositories, it should be fairly straightforward to find it. And we've seen a lot of great progress there and a lot of great ideas there. So, well, we didn't get the whole thing in Rena. We didn't get to rewrite the whole internet. We did get a lot of value out of that exploration. And it's nice to be able to pull that into an actual production system and see that in real life, because actually no one did that. Rena's been around since 2008, and no one really implemented Rena into a production system. And so this is really the first time where anything even like it or inspired by ideas from it is being pulled into something that's actually fairly large and significant. Now, there are other areas that we have been exploring innovation in. For example, we've had to think a lot about incentives. We've had to think a lot about stake pools. We've had to think a lot about rational actors in a system. And this is where we have things like the CIP process we need to roll out, things like voting, things like the Treasury system. We've written several papers on the Treasury system. We think a lot about voting, and there are specialized teams within IOHK that are doing exactly what we were doing with Plutus, where we have a product manager on the R&D side, basically getting it to a point where we have a clear execution thread. And Bin Chang is that equivalent to Manuel Chakravarti on the voting side and on the Treasury side, and great progress has been made there. As with all things, all of these threads, regardless if we're talking about done stuff like proof of stake to wide blue open greenfield R&D, it's a long-term effort, and you release something, but there's always more to do. There's always the next step. For example, the Samsung S10 is a phenomenal product. It's probably the best phone at the time it was released. Certainly the most powerful, 12 gigabytes of RAM, a terabyte of storage, I think 6-core processor, very powerful phone. But yet there's going to be an S11 and an S12, and protocols are the same way. So whatever version we create, there's always going to be something more to do and something more to push out. So then that's really the point of the roadmap, is it's kind of a living document where it collects the facts of the past and puts them there so new entrants in the project can see how far we've gone and how much progress has been made. And it gives you an increasingly higher resolution over time viewpoint of where the project is going. And the types of things that you worry about are less broad and far more specific over time. Okay. So that's kind of how to use the roadmap, and just keep coming back to it, and we'll keep pushing up updates. Pretty happy overall with the quality of the research, and also I just love the fact that code is really starting to cascade and be written in a much faster rate. And I really do honestly believe Shelley is coming out this year, and I really honestly do believe staking is coming out this year. And I really do honestly believe that Goguen is also going to be hit sometime this year. There's the velocity we have and the developers we have, the understanding we have of these particular problems is quite good. And there's not a lot of technological barriers, I'd say, to prevent us from pushing in that direction. Unforeseen things can happen. A bunch of our developers could be on a plane and the plane could crash. I could die. You never know. Life is life, and events can occur. But bearing disaster or bearing unforeseen events, the velocity does suggest that we will be able to deliver a fairly significant portion of Shelley and Goguen this year. But even Shelley is never quite done, because decentralization is not an achievable target. It's an aspiration. No matter how decentralized you are, by definition, you can always be more decentralized. No matter how well you are at writing smart contracts, or how high quality your languages are, you're always going to have the next version of the language. You're always going to have the next library. You're always going to have the next tool, because problems change, scope changes. You learn things over time. Innovations occur, competition occurs. So the goals of Gauguin, the goals of Shelley will continue on well past 2019 and 2020 and well into the future for either us or future generations of developers to aspire to achieve. And that's exactly the point. That said, what really gets me excited is now that we've rewritten code, now that we're starting to see features come in that we really need to have, like staking, we are now able to start talking about completely new features. For example, contingent settlement, or embracing the DID standard and bringing identity into the protocol, or looking at various services that Ouroboros can start providing to smart contract developers. For example, concepts like Ouroboros Chronos, which will provide timestamping services, or other things like Ouroboros, which can actually allow Cardano to become a cryptographic beacon, and so forth. So these are the things that really excite me because they're new, or it's a new way of doing them, and it adds a lot of value to everybody in the entire ecosystem. And also, it really excites me that we have a lot of high quality ways now for people to build great applications. So anyway, that's everything about the roadmap. Now, there have been a few things said about, well, what is the difference between Cardano CL and Cardano SL? Now, you may have noticed that we were the first project to really start talking about this multi-layered setup where some things handle just settlement and that are slow and methodical, and other things are more ephemeral and they handle concepts like data and computation and so forth. So when you look at those types of things, for example, the Ethereum 2.0 roadmap, or other systems that have been proposed, it's another one of those aspirations that you chase, and there's many things to look for. For example, MPC. This has yet to be introduced into the cryptocurrency space, but it's something we did mention in the Y Cardano paper back in 2017. And as we get into the Gauguin era, a lot of the effort will not be, can I write a dApp and have that dApp run on a blockchain? That's 2016, 2015. That's a solved problem. It'll be more, can I now take the users that I find and interact with on the main chain and go into my own little computational domain, do some stuff with them, send value into that system, and then be able to shut that down and leave once we've finished that computation. So the canonical example of that is a poker game. And it's a really easy example to wrap your mind around to get a sense of how this would work. So you'd have the chain be able to locate people, bring people together, and then once they're brought together, they'd lock their money on the main chain, and then they would be able to operate within this kind of temporary mini chain that operates somewhere privately just with the players. And there are strong guarantees that people can't cheat. And then once the game has concluded, they're able to withdraw their winnings and losses. All the operations of the game can be thrown away safely, and a little bit of a checkpoint is basically put on the main chain. So in other words, you can scale with the users themselves. That's a very powerful system. And we've written protocols like Royale and Kaleidoscope, and there are entire cryptocurrency ideas like the Enigma project out of MIT that are exploring these ideas. The second concept are things like what Starkware is pursuing, or some people at Ethereum are pursuing, and other projects are pursuing, of this idea of doing off-chain computation to be then verified by a zero-knowledge proof or some compressed representation. So if you look at concepts like Cardano CL, what we're really talking about there is saying that you have different models. You have models like the MPC model. You have models like zero-knowledge crypto used for verification of the crypto of the smart contract. Models like having permission ledgers, for example, a Fabric instance or an Atala instance that runs as its own network, but then you're going to be moving users, information, and value between those systems and back. So this is where the space is ultimately going, because at the end of the day, you're going to have thousands of chains talking to each other, and they're going to be special purpose. Some will be long-lived, some will be temporary. some will be private, some will be public, and it's important to be able to move information, identity, users, and state information, data feeds, all these things between these different systems. So this was really the concept of what we were talking about when we were saying Cardano CL and Cardano SL. The philosophical point of SL, though, was the system needs to have enough programmability and capability to be used as a financial operating system. So it needed a scripting language, and it needs to have a notion of identity, it needs to have a notion of metadata, and it needs to be able to scale to a very large amount of users, eventually millions to billions. So it was an open question when we wrote Why Cardano of how expressive could we have the blockchain, the scripting language associated with the blockchain before we risked security issues or before we risked existential issues where this expressiveness could cause flaws that could halt the system or substantially delay the system or be counterproductive to our scaling goals. Now, we've learned a lot along the way as a consequence of building Plutus. We've learned a lot along the way in just the design of ledgers and accounting systems, like, for example, the chimeric ledgers design that we came up with. And so as a consequence, it meant that we could make the base layer a little bit more expressive than we anticipated in 2017. That doesn't mean the goal of the base layer of Cardano is to be a world computer and basically Amazon cloud services in the sky for blockchains. This is not the point. The point is for it to be a beautiful place to put identity, metadata, a beautiful place for it to coordinate financial stories of people. And we hope in the developing world, but ultimately across the entire world for all kinds of applications. And then to be a layer that allows you to move those stories into the domains that make the most sense, whether those be permission private systems, other public systems, ephemeral domains like MPC domains, your own server just being verified with a Stark or a Snark or some other primitive. This is basically the vision in the relationship between Cardano SL and Cardano CL. Not only has that vision been validated by internal research, that vision's also been validated by the industry as a whole. It seems like most credible projects with large R&D budgets and good founders are moving into a multi-layer architecture where a lot of the more bespoke, higher performance demand components are being pushed outside of the main ledger. So we were the first project to really start chasing that. We put it down on paper. We came up with a fairly good strategy for it. And it's really, really nice to see in retrospect that not only are we making progress there, but the space as a whole is also moving in that particular direction. So CLSL still is as it is. CL isn't going away. We're definitely going to move further along that concept, and later releases will discuss that in more detail, especially as we get into the Goguen era. And we're quite happy to see what's been done there. But overall, the project is becoming more realistic and mature, and the project is moving from aspirational to practical. As with all things, when you move from aspirational to practical, and you down scope and you get focused, there are certain things that people like, and there are certain things that people are disappointed in. And that's just the reality of all things where you're actually delivering something that people care about. But I'm pretty proud of how we've done our architecture, what we've learned from the code rewrites. I'm pretty proud of the processes we put into place, and the 200 people that work at IOHK, most of whom are in some way connected in some form to Cardano or to related projects that will probably add synergistic value to Cardano. I'm also very proud that we kept our principles along the way. It would have been incredibly easy for us to cut some corners here and there for the sake of expediency or in some sort of vanity attempt to get some extra market share when it didn't make sense to do that, especially during 2017 and the first half of 2018, where everything in our industry seemed to be led by hype rather than real life practical things. But now I think the market somewhat validated the decisions we've made, and I'm very happy about that. Now, there are a lot more things to do. There are a lot more challenges to do. For example, we do have to curate the introduction of the CIP process. One of the silent consequences of the Shelley release will be that it's going to be more difficult for us to update the system because we can no longer unilaterally just simply push a hard fork or a soft fork, as a committee. So we can't go to Cardano Foundation, Emergo, and our developers internally, reach a consensus and push something. Now there will be stake pools and staking running the system. And some people may actually have divergent opinions about upgrades that we choose to make. So it's important that over time, fairly quickly, we have to start capturing these upgrades into Cardano improvement proposals in the same way that Bitcoin captures them with Bitcoin improvement proposals and Ethereum captures them with Ethereum improvement proposals, and other credible cryptocurrencies follow in that suit. So that's an endeavor we've been talking about quite a bit, and it's something that's going to take a little bit of time to work its way through. And it's important that this process be done correctly. Then that process will be connected to increasingly more democratic systems, and then perhaps that can even be put into a blockchain-based voting system to ratify CIPs in a similar way that to what Tezos is approaching. One of the benefits of having Tezos actually look at blockchain-based voting for chain amending is we actually kind of get a try before we buy as an ecosystem, where we can watch the successes and failures of that project without exposing people in Cardano to undue risk. It is dangerous to introduce too much democracy or too much choice too early in a young nascent project, especially when the majority of people don't fully appreciate or understand the vision, goals, or underlying technology. It's much better to have highly focused groups working quickly and in a very methodical, lockstep way to make sure that foundational elements are in place, especially if there's a social consensus that the things we're going to be following are based upon a collection of peer-reviewed research documents rather than community-given update proposals, as we've seen with Bitcoin, for example. That said, it's nice that we're living in this Darwinian petri dish where many projects are competing with each other and giving great ideas and providing a great degree of basically what if we did it this way, and we get to kind of follow that thread along and see the pros and the cons without exposing ourselves to that risk. And so it's basically a giant wisdom machine. So we're quite happy to see how far along the industry's moved. A significantly easier thing to do is the Treasury system, and there's already a nice viable design, we feel. And my goal is to get that implemented sometime in Q1 of 2020. Because I think it's incredibly important that the community has an alternative source of funding available for its own projects, whether that be third-party development, for funding of projects, or just simply to pay alternative developers, so that people have more degrees of freedom as Cardano continues to get more and more decentralized as an ecosystem. So it's really nice to see that we have a lot of clarity, and organizationally speaking, most of the people at IOHK are so deep into the product that they're really excited about how the potential of what we can do. We've been inundated with requests from people who want to deploy on Cardano, want to use Cardano, everything from Fortune 1000 companies to governments to municipalities, and that is probably not going to stop anytime soon. I am very, very happy with that channel, and I believe very firmly that once things are made available, with or without IOHK, Emergo, and other actors, we're going to see pretty swift adoption of Cardano as a platform to deploy applications on, and a platform to handle a lot of complex financial arrangements. So this is something that makes me pretty excited, and it's something that's been validated by constant travel throughout the world. And speaking of constant travel, I'm about ready to go on my last major trip of the year. and hopefully the last major trip I do for a long while. I'm going to be going to Japan, Georgia, and Israel very shortly, meeting with several heads of state. And then after that, I'll be traveling to Uganda. Uganda, we're meeting with some of the royal family there, as well as the head of state, and attending several major events. Then from Uganda, I'm flying to Korea for several conferences and other events and private meetings with large companies there in Korea. And then after Korea, I'll be traveling to Argentina for our largest hackathon we hope to hold, and that's the one in Buenos Aires. After that, I'm going home, and I'm going to be staying at home for a bit. So you won't see me traveling as much post July, but this is the last major trip. So I enjoy meeting all of you. I enjoy spending time with all you guys. I do enjoy these updates, and I do enjoy the dialogue. This industry is pretty hard at times. It's pretty harsh at times, and it does tend to attract colorful personalities. But I'd like to believe that the majority of the people in this industry are well-intended, and they do believe in a better world. And I'd like to believe that the technology that we're building is part of the solution for that. But it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take a lot of hard work. And we're just going to keep showing up every day and keep doing that hard work every day. And now some of that hard work is your responsibility. As the self-node testnet comes out, there's going to be a lot of things to do, and we can't really do all of that. You guys are going to have to go and test that. You guys are going to have to go and run that on hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of different configurations and submit the Git issues and let us know what's working and what's not working. This is how we are going to get to a system that's useful for everyone. And then in short order, the beta testnet will be out, and then we'll have to repeat all the things we did on the self node now on the beta testnet. And every time we do this, it's going to get better and better, and we'll wake up and Shelley will be released. And then the network is being run by the community, and will be 100 times more decentralized than Bitcoin. And then at that point, there's the CIP process. And at that point, there's the update to Goguen. And at that point, we are talking about treasuries and scalability and other such things. And little by little, the community will take more and more, and we'll wake up one day and I'll be frankly irrelevant. And that'll be a really good day. That'll be the happiest day of my life. So anyway, thank you guys for all your feedback on the roadmap. I'll tomorrow have a great time on the Cardano effect, and that'll be a fun episode with David and me and the rest of the gang. Keep buffeting us with questions, and keep the Reddits hot, keep the Telegram channels hot, and let's go build some stuff. Cheers.